to the show with your friend and mine. So tell me, Dr. Squee, who's it gonna be this time? We like to hear you talk, but we love to hear you listen. And if you are not subscribed, you won't know what you're missing. So welcome to the Dr. Squee Show. Welcome to the Dr. Squee Show. Welcome to the Dr. Squee Show. Headphones up. Here we go.
Hello and welcome to the Dr. Squee Show. I'm Dr. Squee and this is my show. Hope you're all doing well out there today. Last week, I had on Abigail from the Neurodivergent Moments podcast to talk a little bit about both her career and also about neurodivergency. So as I've mentioned over the last few weeks, it's something which I'm finding out a bit about as I'm in the process of being diagnosed with inattentive ADHD. And Abigail, we talked so much about the podcast and also about her co-host. She was very kind enough to hook us up. So please welcome. He is a stand-up comedian. He is the co-host of the Neurodivergent Moment podcast, as well as the Emergency Mixtape podcast. Please welcome to the Dr. Squee Show, Mr. Joe Wells. Hello, Joe. How are you, sir?
Thank you for having me.
It's very exciting to have you on. It is a kind of sort of like weird moment to be suddenly talking about this stuff, which I haven't, as I'm kind of figuring it out myself. So thank you very much for joining me and for indulging me speaking a little bit about this. It's been really great listening to the podcast, and so many of the moments which you guys talk about really chime with my experiences, and it just makes you feel like you're in the right place. So I just want to start by thanking you very much for the show.
Oh, no, you're welcome.
Awesome. So what's the first thing you did, the book which you wrote at 16 about OCD, or does it even go further than that with you in the entertainment world?
No, so I had very severe OCD when I was a teenager, I wanted to be a writer. Wrote a few pages of that. It was just after Luke Jackson's books, Freaks, Geeks. It was called Freaks, Geeks, and Asperger Syndrome, been published. There are a couple of other sort of similar things being published by Jessica Kingsley publishers at the time. This is sort of 20 years ago now, so that was published when I was 15, and then I sort of got into stand-up, did lots of political stand-up, some sort of found out some stuff about my time when I was a child, my childhood, and it's a long and boring story, but they wanted to put me forward for an autism diagnosis when I was going through sort of therapy for the OCD stuff, but that didn't happen, so I sought the diagnosis sort of fully as an adult. And then my second book came out last year, just sort of I do stand up and stuff like that. Yeah.
So at 16, what kind of like did it just seem like something you had to do, or did it seem like it seems from the outside as an unusual thing to do as a 16-year-old to write this whole book and get it published? Did it just seem kind of natural to you? Was it helpful?
I was probably quite a precocious child. Who was like, I'm going to be a writer. And I guess where I'd had this sort of unusual experience. Sorry. I'm trying not to die on your podcast.
Please don't. Yeah.
I'd had this sort of unusual
awful advert for the show.
I'd had this sort of unusual experience as a sort of going through mental health services as a teenager. And so I sort of, I guess, it sounds very sort of I think my mum probably is a factor. She sort of saw that there was a space for a book like this. She worked in mental health by that point, or in education. I can't remember exactly what her job was at that point. So she was aware of other books that were being published by young people, so she encouraged me. And I wrote a chapter sort of just on a whim, really, and then it was sent off to this publisher by my mum, and then they seemed interested in it. So yeah,
doesn't seem to have phased you much. Was it kind of sort of very? Did it feel very much?
No, it was very exciting at the time. Obviously, it was a long time ago now. There's a new edition which came out a couple of years ago as well, And yeah, I mean, I think I was in the right place at the right time. I think this was a time where people were just coming round to the idea of service users, for want of a better term, writing about their experiences. Before then, a lot which was written about mental health was written by professionals and clinicians.
Yes.
So that this was sort of the time when people were going, oh, maybe there's sort of another side to this experience that could be heard and could be useful to other people experiencing those things, and also just of interest to professionals and to anyone. A lot of parents read the book to sort of understand their children or young people. So so I think not to downplay it, but to some extent I was in the right place at the right time with the book.
It sounds a little bit like it just reminds me of when you were talking on the Neurodivergent podcast. You've spoke a couple of times on there around the fact that you sort of like you found out about the autism diagnosis, but your mum was kind of already aware of it.
Yeah, there's different versions of the story. So my mum, if my mum was here, she would say that they put to me having the diagnosis as a teenager, and that I was very against it. I didn't want to be diagnosed. I don't really remember that. But the thing is that I do realize when it came out as an adult that it was talked about in sort of euphemistic terms, because my mum actually ran a support group for parents of autistic children. But I think it was talked about as Joe's wired differently and that sort of thing, was what was said about me. But I think I was more interested in other things. I wasn't interested in, and didn't pick up on the sort of subtext of these things that were being said. So it was. It wasn't picked up certainly by me, and picked up by everyone around me. But I didn't sort of start to think about it properly until I was in my maybe just turned 30, around that time. But I think I've since seen the notes from when I was going through what would now be called CAM, so children's therapy, and the stuff that was written about my autisticness as a teenager. It's not how I would view autisticness now, and I think it was written about what it meant to be autistic 20 years ago. It was a different, obviously autistic people were the same, but what it meant culturally to be autistic was a different thing, and when I look at those notes, there's a very negative things written, sort of the autisticness is written about in a very negative way, and that's not how I would view things now. So yeah, it's I think it's easy when you get diagnosed as an adult to go, oh, if I'd been diagnosed as a child, everything would have been better. But actually, I think it would have been, I would have had different struggles rather than no struggles.
It's definitely something which I've thought a lot about. It's like, you first of all think, oh, what if I'd known earlier?
Yeah,
and then it's more a case
everything
of
would have been fine. It would have all been good.
yeah, it would have been magic and rainbows. I mean, the only thing is, I might have got through diagnosis before the waiting list became 2 years. That's the only thing which I wish it would have been. Nice. Do you find yourself like I did go through this kind of period, which I'm sort of like coming to the end of now, where to begin with, it was almost like I was doing an audit of everything which had happened before, and kind of like, is that a moment? Is that a moment when that was being displayed? Did you go through anything like that, or was it different for you?
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah, and still am, and I still I've been reading Pete Warby's new book, and there's stuff in that where I go, oh, that's why I do that, and because I think, I don't know whether you feel this with ADHD, but a lot of, if you're sort of autistic in a way that you can blend in to some extent, where it's not immediately apparent to people that you're autistic, you end up, you have to sort of, there's masking involved, and so sometimes things that I do, which I would see as sort of almost like secondary autistic traits, because my sort of base state is so far one way, that I then have really overcompensated it the other way. And there's a bit in Pete's book about where I realized that I can sort of I can overread into subtext, and I'm always looking out for subtext in what's being said, because I was always told you didn't pick up on that person said, that they were cold, and what they meant was they want you to close the window. So I'm sort of over analyzing those things, and I think that so that was sort of I'm still now having things where I go, oh yeah, I do that, and it's either an autistic thing or it's an autistic sort of secondary sort of compensatory thing. So it's it's really, really complicated. And Abigail has talked about how she's always very on time for things because she knows that lateness is her natural state. So she's incredibly vigilant, and will get somewhere like an hour or much earlier than she needs to be because to overcompensate for that, I guess.
Yeah, you get lateness is a thing, like, because I just got sick and tired even before I got any kind of like whiff of a diagnosis, or a kind of like, if like I didn't know what an intensive ADHD was until a friend of mine told me about it. And just the amount of times I'd arrive late to something, goes like, here he is again, like, it's that thing, everyone expecting it, that's the worst thing about it. And you don't want to be the late guy.
So are you very early for things now? Are you?
Yeah, I mean, basically, there's a friend of mine who I made in last year who she's got intensive ADHD, and she said it's like, I feel like these are, things which show that you probably got it, or probably are inattentive ADHD. And then I was like, it was that thing of like, laughing it off. And I think a lot of the people who've had on the show have said it's like, to win with you, just go, no, I don't think so. I'm just a bit quirky. I'm just a bit different. And then you look through the kind of criteria, and it's like everything matched. And just the more I've looked into it, and again, more I've listened to your show and to other things online, the more traits that I share. It's, my mum tried to get me diagnosed with standard ADHD, I guess, when I was at school, but they wouldn't put me forward for testing because I didn't tick enough the boxes. And probably then, because I was younger, probably manifested itself a bit more kind of outwardly. Whereas I think there is also the degree. See, this is the thing, I'm trying to sort of like figure it out all in my head as we speak, because it's like, I think intensive ADHD probably fits me better. However, I know there's a degree of what you're talking about with the masking of like internalizing stuff, because previously I was very external, very verbose, very big, and that kind of led to negative feedback from people. So it's kind of unpacking all that. But it's like at the moment I find that it's very hard to action things, but I've got 1,000,001 ideas in my head at any given time. But it's getting one done at a time and actually focusing on an activity, which is kind of like, so that's kind of where I'm at the moment. I got put through the doctors, like they do that preliminary test for you to do online first, and that kind of gives you a score. And then I was kind of quite a few points over whatever the baseline score was. And so then they put me into the waiting list, which is, as I say, it's 2 years at the moment. So right now I'm just trying to learn everything I can, like, something which I was going to talk to you a little bit about, because it's like the doctors started talking to me once I was in the waiting list of like, right, we can't give you any ADHD medication, but we can try stuff to help you with anxiety and depression, which is some things I think I've dealt with tangentially because of the ADHD side of things and neurodiversity. And I've just recently been trying a medication which really just knocked me for six. I tried it for a month and it wasn't getting any better. I've just stopped taking it. And it's just been I've realized there's no point in trying to mask things which are caused by the thing you're trying to get some assistance with and learn how to deal with. Does that all make any kind of sense?
Yeah, totally. There's so many like layers to it, isn't there? And where what is a result of what is like a secondary thing to being neurodivergent? What is secondary to being neurodivergent in a world that isn't always accommodating to neurodivergent people, where there's a lot of shame attached to being neurodivergent? That's going to have an effect on people. So I've got no answers, but I think it is complicated, and there's so many there's so much to unpick. And then on top of that, I think a lot of our sort of descriptors of, I mean, I don't know a lot about ADHD, so I can't really comment on ADHD, but certainly with autism, I think a lot of the way it's been written about and described has been from the outside. Polly Samuel wrote about this, who I think is a really important autistic writer. And there's the idea of double empathy, you know, there are ideas of what it means to be autistic, and therefore all the diagnosis process and that sort of thing, they all come from the outside, and they come from a sort of, you know, pathologizing view of these things. So yeah, you know, there's a lot to unpack, and yeah, I don't have any easy answers for it.
Damn, I was hoping.
Other than acknowledging that it is complicated, you know, and I think sometimes it's you know, when people have a sort of overly simplistic view, which I think the straight medical model is, that's one of the issues with it, is it's just overly simplistic. It's, you know, people have this thing and it means they can't do X, Y, Z. You know, that's overly simplistic to me, and you know, and it's not helpful to, yeah, you got to sort of embrace some of the sort of complicatedness of it.
Definitely. And it's what you're talking about. Like, I feel like I want to explain terms to people as well. So like when I talk about medication, it's not to cure it. Like we don't need a cure. Like we're good. Like the way we think it is a fine and great thing. Just the medication for ADHD can help, like the stimulants which they can give you, which can help you turn your process a bit more active, essentially, so you can actually action things. But then, as I understand it, you then have to kind of prioritize what you're doing when, so you're not trying to do everything at once actively. And there's so many kind of complicated things. So, but it's like, I don't want people to think that I'm trying to medicate something away. It's just get some assistance with some processing things and kind of like energy levels as well. Like, is there any side of the medication to help with things for autism, or is that just an ADHD kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I was on SSRIs when I had some mental health problems, and whether they were secondary to being autistic, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, generally, you know, I am very skeptical of anything that's sort of medication for autisticness.
Yeah.
You know, I think if there's, you know, things which are secondary and which, you know, help, you know, if people have sort of associated sort of issues with, you know, I don't know, a lot of autistic people have stomach issues and things like that, don't they? You know, I'm not in any way an expert on that sort of thing, but I'm certainly, I don't, I'm against sort of any treatment for traits or behaviors which are not harmful and are just unusual. And I think a lot of what's been called sort of autism treatment in the past has really been, you know, trying to undo unusual behavior rather than harmful or dangerous behavior. And I'm very in favor of people being unusual.
Yeah, I'm trying to embrace. I mean, again, it's sort of like part of that started before I again even thought about any of this stuff. So I'd start to be more accepting and wanting to embrace the kind of weird side of myself, or the, as I said, that's how I was terming it at the time. Now I kind of even question terms like weird. Is that helpful or is that marginalizing? But I try to sort of like embrace that side of myself as opposed to trying to suppress it. And just the diagnosis is so helpful. Again, it's just like there's nothing wrong with me. I'm not processing things badly and processing things differently. And I think it's that kind of language which is a lot more helpful. Like something which I love from the show and from kind of some stuff which you've written about is about like how about terminology. So something I was talking about with Abigail is about the term neurodiverse versus neurodivergent. So neurodiverse is a set of people who think differently, whereas neurodivergent describes people who like you know, have ADHD or autism or something like that. But anyway, sorry, I'm going very off track there. One thing I did want to talk about was in the show, you talk about some of the ways people react to you when you're doing stand-up and people not being able to wrap their brain around stand-up and autism. That's really
Yeah, I
interesting
think
about that.
it comes back to that medical model, doesn't it? Because I think that probably certainly people come talk to me after a gig, and usually that means catching me outside of the green room where it's quite noisy and hectic. I think I probably come across as more autistic in those situations than I do on stage. And I think a common thing is like you don't seem autistic on stage. You know, you wouldn't think of being on stage, and I think that's quite an interesting indicator of what sort of the sort of medical model and like sort of a deficit model. So of an idea of like autism as things that are wrong with people and that they can't do, because people see someone doing something and go, well, they can't be autistic because they're doing a thing usually well. And, to me, I think that when I'm doing comedy is actually when I'm most autistic. You know, I'm not trying to hide any of my sort of autisticness. I move my hands a lot when I am on stage. I sort of understand that it's a conversation that works very well for me, where it's very much one way. You know, I'm prepared and it works for me. So I always think it's interesting that people sort of see me doing something well, or doing the thing I'm good at, and see that as sort of pushing against the autisticness. Whereas I think that's the sort of the most autistic. That's when I'm at my most autistic. I think is when I'm doing comedy.
I guess you get to like have things how you would like that. You know, it's like Angela Barnes mentioned on your show that it's like society has to be built to the majority. That's just how it works in society. However, like there's so many conditions which are not built for the neurodiverse necessarily. For people with autism, you talked about like forgetting your headphones.
Yeah, I mean, comedy is quite built for autistic people. You know, I mean, my day is that I get up, I I read books that interest me, and I do things that interest me, and write about stuff that is of interest to me. And then I drive either on my own, listening to music I like, or with another comedian where we have a shared special interest. I get to my gig, I go to the quiet room with a couple of other people who all have a shared special interest with me. I go out for 20 minutes and talk about something I'm interested in to people. There's no pressure of being socially inappropriate. If you say something inappropriate to someone at a comedy gig, then everyone laughs and it's very funny. And then go back to the quiet room and then drive home, listen to the music that I'm interested in. So it's completely set up for me. So it's I've never otherwise I had a full-time job for a few weeks and then was fired. But I've done part-time jobs and other bits and pieces, but I've never really had like a proper full-time job apart from comedy. So this is I think that's why there are lots of comedians who are neurodivergent in one way or another, because it's sort of set up for us a bit more.
Yeah, certainly. I think working entertainment, working things where it's like, you get some control of your environment. Like, what you were saying about forgetting your headphones. I literally did that last night. Again, sorry, I'm taking stuff from one of the episodes I was listening to from neurodivergent moments or neurodiverse moments. And it was it was when you were talking about forgetting your headphones when you're in town and being super noisy. I have it, but for a very different kind of reason. If I forget my headphones, which I did last night when I was going to a pub quiz, just the amount of things which were distracting me and the amount of places my head wants to go. Even if I've got my headphones on, I'm not really listening to the podcast or the radio show or the music I'm listening to. There is something kind of like just my brain's not being distracted by the million and other things around me.
Yeah, I mean, occasionally sort of I forgot my headphones going into, I think at a gig in Leicester Square, and realised that I'd forgotten my headphones when I drove to Wimbledon and then got the train in. So occasionally there's times where I realised that it's quite difficult sort of existing in the world as an autistic person, but most of the time I've sort of managed to build my own little world where things work for me. which is a huge
great.
privilege. A lot of people aren't able to do it. So, I don't want to be sort of make out like, oh, all people have to do is just make things work. I'm very lucky to work in the arts. It's very difficult to work in the arts, and there's lots of reasons why people aren't able to sort of build a world that works for them for different sort of social or whatever reasons. So I'm very lucky to be able to do that.
That's brilliant. Actually, something else I wanted to mention when we were talking about things which people kind of assume about autism. I did love it when I was listening to Ria Lena on your show, and she was talking about a doctor actually said the way she walked wasn't autistic enough for a diagnosis. I mean, just some of the things which people I can't believe a doctor said that, amongst other things. Is there a kind of particular worst one you've had from it?
Well, it is obviously that's a silly thing for a doctor to be dismissive about. There is a thing around often. I have a walk which is, there's something about the way I walk which is different to everybody else, and I've never quite been able to work it out. And there is also a thing with autistic people often walking on tiptoes, so it's not a completely sort of far out thing, but it is. There's the complicated thing with autistic people where there's stereotypes, and then there's sort of the truth, and there's a little bit of grey area in between where things like autistic people don't make eye contact is a stereotype, but then for me it is a true thing as well. So I think that's one of the complicated things, and I think that's one of the issues is obviously Ria's doctor having this like checklist of things, I guess like occasionally I get things on TikTok and stuff like that. Someone said that they didn't think I was autistic because I was making eye contact at a video of me at a gig, and if you've been on like a sort of that, I remember the gig and the sort of very strong lighting, which I quite like. So I can't, even if I wanted to make eye contact with people, I wouldn't be able to do that. So that was a strange theory. I think a lot of those sort of ideas still remain, and I think I understand that people see, more visibly autistic people, and that they go, well, there must be, everyone's getting diagnosed with it now. But I think in the past people were just sort of learnt to assimilate and were very unhappy. Also, I think aspirations are higher for autistic people now. Like, there's a writer called Temple Grandin who's very interesting writer. She was one of the first people to write about being autistic. And her dad wanted her to be put in a hospital for her whole life. So, and it was because her mum was very sort of strong-willed about Temple, going to, going to sort of school where she'd be taught things and so on. And it makes you wonder how many people like Temple were kept out of sight and out of mind. Whereas I think now, obviously, there's still a long way to go, but there's more aspiration for people, and people are not kept out of the way, and people are able to achieve more.
It reminds me of, I used to work in health and safety at the University of Southampton, and someone in a meeting once from one of the departments legitimately said, "Oh, I remember before they invented stress and anxiety." It's like they didn't invent it. And it feels like the same thing we're going through with
who
all
invented
these
that? What a terrible invention!
Exactly. Yeah, I want a word with the person who invented ADHD. I'm not happy with the servicing. But it's like, I think people do misconstrue that more people are kind of making up they've got it, as opposed to we're diagnosing more accurately. Like, they think now that I believe it's 15% of the population are diagnosed, and they think it's probably double that. And it's
ADHD.
Oh, well, this is neurodiversity as a whole.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, and I think the other thing, Andrew and Neil said to me, the I don't think it's their original quote, but said the map is not the territory, and I think all these things are, we exist as people and we are different, and neurodiversity as a fact, that people have different brains, I think that's hard to dispute, is a sort of fact about the world. And then a lot of these terms, I think, are sort of lines that have been drawn around people who exist within, within neurodiversity. So I think like that, yeah, when people worry about overdiagnosis, I sort of think, so what's the sort of negative of that? Just what the people exist anyway, and we want everyone to, be able to be happy and fit into the world and be included. And I think as long as we don't miss people, then I think that where we draw the lines are I don't think it matters too much where those those lines have sort of shifted over the years. I think that's true of sort of who's in what group. But yeah, sorry, I'm rambling on the topic. But
no, I love it. I mean, I think
that's why I like the term neurodivergent, because it's not something that's sort of heavily gate kept, and it moves it from like a medical thing of yes or no, do you have this, towards almost like a sort of socio-political thing of going, well, there's these people, there's a group of people whose brains are unusual and they get a hard time in society. And we have this new term, neurodivergent, which goes, well, that's who we are. We're the ones that get a bit of a hard time because to different degrees, we get a hard time because our brains are unusual. And because we've got this term, we can recognize each other and go, well, we're neurodivergent. We're going to try and change society so that things are easier for us and for other people like us. I think that's why I think neurodivergent is a term I get quite excited about, because it's sort of, but it's quite a sort of culture shift, isn't it? I understand why there's resistance to it, because I think it's quite it's a very different way of thinking, and if you've worked in healthcare or education or whatever for more than 10 years or for any amount of time, really, I can see why it's a sort of a culture shift to start thinking about people in this different way. But yeah, I think it's an exciting way to go.
I think so, and I also think it's then you're addressing the thing which is actually at the root, as opposed to trying to address why someone's why so many people are depressed and anxious. Well, if a big portion of those people are neurodiverse or neurodivergent, and they need to find the people who've gone through this and find ways of kind of existing more healthily for them, you're actually working on the cause, not the actual the end results, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's that sort of what's the analogy of instead of pulling people out of the river, go upstream and find out why they're falling in the river. Yeah, no, and it's not this. My views aren't just from my own experience. I worked the part-time job I had for about 5-6 years. I worked in special needs education with a variety of young people with a variety of different needs, and that idea of the social model of disability, that where the focus should be, the barriers for people. The focus shouldn't be on curing and changing people, should be thinking about the social barriers to them, was something that I believe strongly from that work, really, more so than my own experience. I think the things which made things difficult for the young people that I worked with weren't they weren't the fact that they were autistic or had a learning disability or whatever. It was the fact that they got a bit of a rubbish deal because they were from those groups. So so my sort of belief in all those sort of the neurodiversity paradigm, the idea that being different is having difference is good, and the social model, all those sort of things comes from not just from my own experience, but from meeting lots of other neurodivergent people.
Yeah, I mean, I even think it's more healthy, the way, again, it's that whole thing of auditing the past, and I look back at my previous relationships and where kind of maybe not knowing this about myself wasn't very helpful. There were so many times when I was sort of told off for behaviors by ex-girlfriends, and it's not on them because I didn't understand myself, so how were they going to understand what was going on for me? And as opposed to kind of saying, no, this is why I think like that, and this is why this is helpful to me, I apologized and corrected my behavior. But of course, that's like playing whack-a-mole. Another behavior, another way of me being neurodivergent would kind of crop up, and it would be again. It was, and it's that thing of masking. You just end up treating so many little things about yourself as opposed to realizing this is the core thing at the center of yourself. And it's not a bad thing. And okay, if that doesn't work for you, either we can look at ways where we can make things work for both of us, or this isn't going to work out for you, with me.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I want to do the podcast. I think there's so many interesting parts of neurodivergent experience, which particularly in I'm sorry, we've got very thin walls here. I don't know whether you can hear my neighbour's kids running around, but that's if you hear noise in the background, that's what it is. I think that I'm very interested in. There's so many aspects of neurodivergent experience, particularly for adults, because a lot of stuff that's written about autism in particular is around kids and ADHD as well, as those sort of autistic people sort of get to 18 and then they just don't exist anymore. So it's one of the reasons I want to do the podcast, because I think there's always interesting sort of parts of experience, and we focus the podcast around different sort of broad themes. So Maria, we had on, she talked about dating, and we've had all sorts of different big themes, and I think that I'm very interested in those experiences, because I think that they're important, and I think that it's very hard to get sort of neat definitions of what it is to be autistic, but I think it sort of exists in it's I realize it's a circular thing to say, but like what it is to be autistic is autistic people's experience, and that's how you sort of, if you sort of document the experiences of neurodivergent people, you can sort of put together a picture of that this is what it's like. And
that's great. And just while I remember, give a good plug to the podcast, Neurodivergent Moments podcast. Please do check it out wherever you get your podcasts. And one thing I really love about the show, and it's something which I kind of like only realized after listening to quite a few of them, I think you and Abigail are perfectly matched as hosts together, but it's also, I think there is a kind of the perfectness of the energies between ADHD and autism. And it might just be you two, but it seems to be like you work at each other, like where one of you has a strength in particular area, the other one's got a strength in another area. So you're really good at the terminology, at facts, at kind of like at the organization side of it. And Abigail seems to be good at making those leaps of imagination, which the ADHD mind comes up with all these kind of wonderful, crazy ideas. Is that something you're kind of very conscious of? Is that something which just naturally clicked with you two?
Yeah, I think it's a sort of happy coincidence. I think Abigail is a fantastic comedian and a sort of brilliant. There's never any dead air when we've got Abigail on, because she knows how to sort of fill it, and she's a very good host of a comedy show as well as a comedian in her own right. So I think, but we didn't know each other that well before we did the podcast. We'd maybe met sort of 10 times, but she was doing some stuff about ADHD. I was aware that there weren't a lot of podcasts about neurodivergence, and the ones that did exist, certainly that I'd heard, were often quite sort of earnest, and there'd be sort of sad music over the top, and I thought there was a space for I thought there was space for us to talk about our lives in a way that there wasn't sort of sad or inspiring or whatever. It's just us sort of like chatting with people, and in a way that's sort of maybe funny and interesting, but without being too sort of earnest, And we can, and we get lots of comedians and people from the comedy world on, so hopefully there's some funny in there as well.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, I loved it when she was talking about. I think it was on the Lena one, because I was just listening to that earlier, and Abigail was saying about she wanted a neurotypical like butler to do servant. Actually, all I could think of is like, I want a Joe. I want an autistic kind of like person for the life skills of being able to organize so well. Like that was the bit.
I'm not. I know the terminology for things mostly, but I'm not an organized person. But because Ria said that she wanted, like, in a partner, she'd rather go out with a neurotypical person. I just thought I can't believe that. I couldn't. My wife has ADHD. I couldn't go out with no offense to any listening, I don't think I could have a relationship with someone who was neurotypical.
Yeah, and this is the thing. It's like I would highly recommend this show, especially for people, not especially, but also for people who are just sort of discovering about it all, because it's the questions which you sometimes ask, and sometimes it isn't like here's a question, here's the answer to it. It's like here's a discussion about it, which is very helpful as well. But it's also, it's I mean, I never considered about dating. Am I going to look for someone who's neurodivergent? Like, am I going to look for someone who's neurotypical? These questions are now kind of bubbling up in my head. So it's I do love that discussion side of it, and the way it does, like you were saying before, it breaks down a different aspect of life through the prism of neurodivergency.
Yeah, no, I'm very interested in neurodivergent experience, and I think that's and it's such a new thing. It's only in the 90s that neurodivergent people were writing, and the idea of sort of our experiences was seen as something that's worthwhile. So it's quite an exciting time, I feel, to be producing stuff like that, because this is sort of the early texts in the future, when I think this is for to stay now. I think autistic people and neurodivergent people broadly will always be talking and sharing their experiences, but it's exciting to feel like you're sort of at the beginning of it.
No, that is really great, and it feels like a very exciting time to I mean, I feel like very lucky that I'm discovering this at a time when the discussion is happening more. I seem to switch to things. I don't do it on purpose, but I seem to switch to things when they're getting easier. When I was at school, I was diagnosed with dyslexia. My brother had that at school, or has dyslexia, and he was diagnosed with it at school. But at the time, they didn't know anything about it, so they sat him in the corner making jigsaws until my mum complained. For some reason, she didn't think that was very helpful. I switched vegan just when like more and more vegan products were getting everywhere. I just wait until everything gets easier, then I just jump on the bandwagon, I think.
Dyslexic, we've only had one or two dyslexic guests, certainly only one exclusively dyslexic guest, and I think it's such an interesting thing, isn't it, where dyslexia has only been written about in terms of deficit, but we know that something like 40% of self-made millionaires are dyslexic, and that's not in and of itself a measure of success, but there's something there, isn't there? That if a huge chunk of dyslexic people are doing something entrepreneurial and sort of creating things, and loads of dyslexic people in the creative industries and the arts and stuff like that, there's clearly another side to dyslexic people, where all that is written about is they're not good at writing, they're not good at reading.
And I think that's kind of why I didn't not only didn't know, but didn't seek any other answer, is because like, I knew I was dyslexic, so that's why I think differently. And again, it was another thing I found out through your show. I never even considered the dyslexia sort of counted as neurodivergent. It's like it seems so obvious now. It is a different way of thinking, a different way of processing things. But just things like that I never thought of. And one thing I was discussing with someone earlier, I suddenly had this idea to look up if there was a neurodivergent flag. And I looked it up. And the first thought which came into my head before I looked it up was, I bet we can never agree on the color, though. And surely enough, it's rainbow colored. I love that about it. And it's like, so it's like, for anyone who doesn't know, it's like a Mobius strip symbol in rainbow colors.
Oh, I see that. Yes, I've seen that. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know how I got into that. I'm very tangential today, I think. I did want to talk about your other book. So it's Wired Differently, 30 Neurodivergent People You Should Know. Where did you get the idea from that? And was that mostly people you knew or stories you wanted to look into? How did it get going?
I guess a few reasons. One, so the main reason was it was lockdown and I had nothing to do because all the gigs came out the diary. I had worked. At that point I was still working in what gets called special educational needs and disability. So I felt like there was a. So here's a conversation I would have a lot with young people in my old job, because my job was sort of do sort of consultation things and stuff like that, and there was a push for like inclusion in mainstream schools. I want to have young people with special needs in mainstream schools, and I'd say to young people, what's better, mainstream schools or special schools, and sort of across the board, whether they've had experience of one or the other or both, lots of young people would say special schools are better. And you'd say, why is that? And they'd say, because you get the right support in a special school. And I'd say, well, what if you could get the exact same support in a mainstream school? They'd say, no, still special school, because that's where I fit in. And it feels to me that and when there's like the inclusion is to some extent about putting things in place so people can access environments and be included in that way. But also inclusion is cultural. At a certain point, it's about people feeling included, whether or not they have that one-to-one support or the ability aid or whatever it is. There's a sort of a lid on inclusion if you don't change the culture, if people don't feel that they belong. So I think that so I wanted to do something which would help to sort of change the culture, and it's a young adult book, so in sort of schools and colleges, I thought role models are often how you change culture. If you've got sort of I had a complicated relationship with the word inspiring, because I think often it's just sort of tacked on to things. They're so inspiring, but I think the people I've written about are all to some extent inspiring because they've inspired me to think differently, and to I think they have inspired people to do things, particularly people who are sort of activists and that sort of thing. I'm interested, as I've said, in the experiences and the lives of neurodivergent people. So I researched and found 30 different neurodivergent people who I thought were sort of, they're not necessarily the 30 most like high achieving neurodivergent people, although some of them are. Simone Biles is very high achieving, but they're neurodivergent people I think are interesting and who are, I guess, role models, and whose stories I think are interesting and would be useful to hear. So so read a lot, researched a lot. About half the people in the book I was able to directly interview, find out more about their lives, and it's a book of 30 short biographies of different neurodivergent people, and it was very fun to write. And the big takeaway for me was that I found there's something common in neurodivergent experience which cuts across diagnosis. Most of the people who I wrote about had some experience of feeling at school that they were rubbish and being sort of set back by the education system. A lot of them had experiences of bullying. A lot of them had a sort of moment of realization where they go, oh, this is the thing this is how I make things work for me, so I thought their stories were useful and interesting, and that's why I wrote it, because I think that I hope that if people read those stories, there will be a shift in the culture. People will value and include neurodivergent people more, and I think that's the change, really. Which in some ways, I think that's how you get inclusion, is by people being valued.
Yeah, and I think it's also how you get different books and films and any kind of media. I think that's where we're in a kind of a state of so many things being made, but there's so many things in media which are all to do with neurotypical and to do with the kind of the people in the main of society in any way, shape or form, whether that goes on race, gender, sexual lines, anything like this. It seems the more stories we get from a different perspective, the more interesting the art becomes as well.
Oh, definitely, because their stories haven't been told, have they? I think that's what's interesting about, I spoke with, I hope I pronounced her name, Fahima Abdul-Rahman, who's a video journalist from Sudan, and then she also spent some time a few different countries, just her story is way more interesting than other stories that have already been told. It's a story that hasn't been told before, and I think that people from neurodivergent people from different backgrounds is exciting because they're new stories we haven't heard necessarily.
It's so exciting, and it's again, like I know on this particular one I'm invested particularly to learn more about neurodivergency. but it's like, you know, it's just down to like, even in the superhero movies, when they started including black superheroes and female superheroes, like, like I've not seen a superhero in Africa before. Here's Wakanda. You know, it's like, it's really great to see something different. And I feel like we are getting more interesting media the more we include all these different voices.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen any of the superhero. That's one of the stereotypes I do break, is that I have no interest in superhero films. So that a superhero of any race would be a new experience for me. But yes, I take your point.
Although I'm noticing the Dalek on your wall. Doctor Who's good with you?
Yeah, I do. Doctor Who's good. Yeah, but yeah, I've never got superhero films. But yeah, I know they're very popular.
No, Doctor Who's good enough. Like, I can talk to you about that till the cows come home, if that's helpful. I was going to talk to you about the mixtape podcast. How wonderful that is. It's just such one of those ideas. Like, I've never really seen anything quite like it. If you'd like to just tell everyone what that's about.
Yeah, we haven't put out an episode in years, but we're still not closed. It's still sort of on hiatus. Me and Graham Rice, who's another comedian, but we just both like music and like talking about music. So there's an opportunity for us to talk to other people who like music, and we put together a mixtape for a very specific situation. We've had Angela Barnes on that as well, and Mark Thomas has done it.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, we each pick 2 songs for, you know, a playlist to listen to when we go to the moon or when we go to war, or what other ones have we done? For a revolution. Yeah, sort of broad theme. We pick songs, and me and Graham are both big sort of music nerds, so it just gave us an opportunity to talk about music, really.
Yeah, Mark Thomas was one of the ones, again, I was listening to it just earlier today, and I just love the idea of, he's such a wonderful, different thinker, but it's like, he does this wonderful thing is he can take the most political ideas, but make them so relatable. He's such an everyman.
Oh, I mean, he was one of the first comedians I saw, and he's just such an amazing storyteller. And I think because he's like an important like activist, people forget what a good comedian he is. You know, he's just a good stand-up. I saw that he's doing some comedy clubs. He's doing Banana Cabaret soon. So I think that he's sort of moving back towards sort of more, you know, stand-up comedy, where some of his shows are a bit more theatery for a while. But he's an incredible comedian.
Yeah, I don't know if you'd be able to find it anywhere now, but I used to have this tape. It was like a comedy tape. On one side it was Mark Thomas, and the other side it was another comedian. And it was very early on in his career, and it was before he'd kind of really moved into the political space. And he just told this story about this person who got hired at festival. Like, it was an hour-long story as opposed to like bits of stand-up. Which wasn't really being done at all at the time, so it was kind of quite ahead of the time for something he didn't end up really doing later. So it's kind of he's had a few
but he's always been a good storyteller. His show about the Israel-Palestine conflict, where he walks the length of the sort of the wall in the Gaza Strip. It's just a brilliant piece of storytelling, and there's hold on, my computer's trying to update. Yeah, an amazing piece of storytelling, and it ends with a callback to like a bit that's set up early on. That's such a well structured bit of storytelling. He's amazing. He's really brilliant.
Oh, I really hope you do return back to that show, because again, it was just I love it when someone finds a different engine for conversation. So even though you're doing a playlist on the apocalypse, for instance, it brings up so much conversation of why the person thought of that or why that represents that. So you did one on kind of like the best playlist for quitting your job.
Yes,
and it was just the stories which come up during those recordings is just fabulous.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. No, I really enjoy them. It's Graham's moved back up to Scotland, but we've got a couple that we've recorded. We need to get our act together and put some out, because we've got a couple of really nice ones in the vaults.
One thing I was going to ask if you wanted to, and it's a completely no pressure to do this, but usually what I do near the end of the interview is I offer the guest if they want me to play a song for them on my radio show. So this will go on the radio, this particular episode in 2 weeks' time, because I've got a couple in the bank. However, I was wondering if you want to send me like six songs kind of around the themes of what we've been talking about.
Oh
So
my
like
God,
for example of what you do, because I figure you're someone who likes his mixtapes.
Oh, I would absolutely love that. Yeah, 6 songs. Okay, I will do that.
So you'll do 6 and I'll do 6 and we'll put them together.
Okay, cool.
In the show.
Do they have to be swear free?
Ideally, yeah. Otherwise,
Okay,
I'm going to have to go in and try and find a way of bleeping
No.
doesn't
Okay,
ruin the song.
cool. I will. I'll find some non-swearing. I listen to a lot of rap music. So,
Oh, it's so annoying whenever I think of a song. It's like, oh, I got to play this one on the radio. It's like, where's that one got swearing in? I don't even remember that one being sweary one. No, thank you. Yeah, brilliant. So what you will have heard if you're listening to this on the radio is our choice of kind of like our mixtape for this conversation. Just quickly before I let you go, something you do on the Neurodivergent Moments podcast. Is there a neurodivergent moment which has happened to you this week? Something that's stuck out to you?
What's happened this bit? Do you know what? Like this is maybe a slightly schmaltzy one, but I was recording a thing, and it was like a thing of to camera pieces, and they wanted some sort of I don't know what you call it, just sort of static footage of me just sort of standing still. And I'm fiddling with this today, but I always have something that I'm fiddling with, and so I usually have a hairband on me that I can just sort of move my hands with. And so I wanted to have me doing that and the still shots, and I sort of insisted on me having that on the still shots. So that should be out later this year with Channel 4, and I feel very pleased with that sort of pushing for that representation, because you often don't see people doing that on screen. People have very still hands on TV.
Oh, I love it. And what's the show so we can look out for it?
It's called Joke. Well, there's some debate about what it'll be called when it comes out, but it's the Jokes Only series. So it'll either be Jokes Only a neurodivergent person can tell, or Jokes Only a neurodiverse person can tell. But if it's neurodiverse, there's a sort of bit I've recorded sort of correcting them. So.
And please do come on and talk about that when that comes out. I was going to bring up one myself, because I was thinking, actually, I'm glad you brought up a kind of like, I'm not saying they're usually negative ones, but that's a broadly positive and kind of representational one, which I like. I had an interview late last week, and it's the first time I brought up neurodivergency or my sort of diagnosis, which I'm in the process of trying to get at the moment. And I talked about it, and it's like, it was the most, like previously, I've always been worried about like, if I'm too much myself, if I'm going to get the job or not. Whereas I felt like I was perfectly professionally myself, if that makes sense. So I didn't hide anything about myself, but I found a way of doing it professionally for an interview.
Yeah.
And it felt so positive. Like I genuinely, I hope I've got the job, but it's like, if I don't think I could have been better me in that interview, or more representative of what I might be in the job as well, which is kind of important, because you don't want to hoodwink people. That it's like, if you do the masking, act neurotypical in an interview, I think you're not servicing the person or yourself, because you're not going to be like that when you're in the job.
Yeah, well, it's like dating, isn't it? We see, what's that show, Love on the Spectrum? And all their dating advice is so, like the neurotypical people, like the parents and the family, will go, do this, this, and this, make eye contact, do this, this, and this. And I just think that's terrible dating advice, because if you go on a date and you pretend not to be autistic for an evening, you're not going to be able to do that long term in a relationship. So you're sort of falsely advertising what that person's getting. So even if you sort of succeed in the date, you're setting yourself up for a bad relationship. But yeah, I think it's such a liberating thing when I realized I could have meetings and not worry about making eye contact with people, that sort of thing. It's a very liberating thing.
And there's sorry about Willow there, but yeah, the number of people who tell me to just come down on dates, but be yourself. It's like, well, which do you want me to do? Make your mind up. Like it's one or the other.
Yeah.
Joe, thank you. This has been an absolutely wonderful chat, and thank you for indulging me. Probably questions you've been asked 1,000,001 times.
No, I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. And your show's coming up. Is there anything you want to plug?
I'm on tour at the moment. I think a lot of it's sold out, but there's still quite a few tickets left in Scotland and quite a few in Birmingham. So if anyone is over from those places or knows people from those places, then do buy tickets for that. And we do the podcast is Neurodivergent Moments with Abigail Shimon.
Which I have got the post for right here. Please do check out Neurodivergent Moments wherever you check out your podcast. If nothing else, please subscribe to that and go and see Joe live. Thank you very much, Joe. Have an absolutely wonderful evening. I've been Dr. Squee. That was my show. In a world where you can be truly anything, please be kind.